Our next panel, what are the primary obstacles in achieving racial equality? The first person I'd like to invite to the stage, Justin Gibson, please. Justin recently received his master's degree in biomechanics from the University of Kentucky. He runs the YouTube channel Jangle's Science Lab, where he does debates and makes video essays discussing the academic literature on social issues and comedy. Niko House. Niko House is a U.S. Army veteran, political analyst, activist, host of the online show Mi Casa es Su Casa, and founder of the MCSC network. Sorry about that, bud. Niko founded the largest Bernie Sanders organization in the country, Carolina Students for Bernie Sanders, in 2016. At the tail end of the 2016 primary elections, Niko co-founded the DNC fraud lawsuit with the attorneys from Beck and Lee law firm. He has been a surrogate for Jill Stein, Tulsi Gabbard, and Bernie Sanders. Dr. Karlyn Borysenko. Sorry, I know I had it. Oh my God. Dr. Borysenko, please. She's an organizational psychologist, trainer, author, and executive coach. She became an accidental political and culture commentator after her article about being a Democrat who attended a Trump rally went viral, garnering over 3 million views in a week. After that, she kept running her mouth on the internet from the perspective of a centrist profoundly disturbed by the trial polarization on both sides of the aisle and by the impact of the social justice ideology on culture. You can find her on, on her YouTube channel. And then, of course, Melissa Chen.
There's a lot of diversity on this panel. I think it was accidental, right?
Get up there.
So, thanks, Justin. I'll introduce myself. Like Napoleon, I'll crown myself moderator for this event. I'm Brian Edward. I am the host of the Myth Informed podcast that nobody knows, but an event organizer for Myth Informed. I work with Sean and Fritz, and they're great guys. They pulled me into this thing. I initially didn't want to, but sometimes your passions pick you, and you don't get to pick your passions. So today we're going to have a talk on racial equity. So announced is often equality. There's a difference between racial equity and racial equality. And these kind of topics are super fraught with the entire topic of race, I think, is a minefield for most people. And not a real minefield, not the Call of Duty minefield that's easier to navigate. So we really want to encourage people to be as open and honest on this panel as possible. And I think everybody here, and Niko, I could see you, is apt to do that, because we always want the space to be kind of a white flag for partisanship to come by together and actually get to the truth of what we think and what we feel. And as anyone that knows me personally, I lose things all the time, all the time. And I asked Karlyn to please knit me a tie while we're on stage, because I've forgotten that, and I just spent a lot of time looking for a bag, which now I've put in the corner. So I want to give first a definition that we've pulled, that I tried to get a balanced definition of what racial equity is. So let me read this. So this is for the Center for Social Inclusion definition. We define racial equity as both an outcome and a process. As an outcome, we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes, when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live. As a process, we apply racial equity when those most impacted by structural racial inequity are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. So I want to ask, is this a laudable goal, or is this, as some might say, a dog whistle for equality of outcome? And let's start over here with you, Justin. What are your thoughts on this?
I definitely don't think it's a dog whistle for equality of outcome. I think it's a dog whistle, if you want to call it that, for fulfilling the promise of the American dream. If you look at a lot of the especially the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement in the past, these have been movements trying to fulfill that promise that all men are created equal.
Yeah, keep your mic up just a little bit. So
Okay. Yeah, these have been promises to fulfill that promise in the Constitution, and the kind of the founding ethos of our society that all men are created equal, and we just haven't gotten there yet. So I think it's pretty inarguable that at least we can all agree that the history of racism and structural oppression in this country has contributed in a very large amount to the racial inequalities and the disparity of outcomes that we see so far. And there's a lot of research to say that we still see a lot of, we can call it racism, we can call it racial bias or anything like that. We still see a lot of that across most institutions in the United States. So I think it's not a dog whistle for equality of outcome. It's a dog whistle to fulfill, as the greatest country on earth, what our founding ethos was.
Okay, and that is equal opportunity. What's the founding ethos?
That all men are created equal, and that everyone should have the same shot at success. And if someone is starting 50 meters behind, it's not really an equal shot, is it? No matter, even if we're trying to reach the same finish line.
Okay. What about Niko? Do you think what about 50 meters behind? Do you think how is Justin characterizing this, and how would you frame it?
So let me just say I have no idea what I'm doing on this panel, but I'm going to try my best here. I agree with him, and what he's referring to is equitable opportunity, basically. And it is indisputable that there has not been equitable opportunity. And for those who may be curious, I don't care what your political party is, they participated in making sure that opportunity has been diminished. We can look at FDR's New Deal, which created the Fair Housing, or Federal Housing Administration. It wasn't called that, but that's what it eventually ended up becoming. This same Federal Housing Administration that created so many opportunity for people to build infrastructure in the suburbs, and we saw what happened because of that. They also legislated in law, you cannot qualify for a federal loan to build your suburb if you're a contractor, unless you keep black people from getting a house in your suburbs. Now, with that, the number one creator of wealth in this country is real estate. It's having a house, because people take out second mortgages to start small businesses. They pass those homes down to their children. For those of you who are concerned about breakdown of the family, this goes down to that. They pass their homes down through generations. Now, all I have to worry about is paying a property tax rather than paying a rent or a mortgage if I'm that child. And that disallowed us from having any chance of keeping up. Like the chance to keep up, not based off of my own decisions, but based off of a law that was written to prevent me from having equitable opportunity to achieve the same financial goals as my white brothers and sisters to the left or the right of me. And when you're talking about something like redlining, which that's basically what that was, yeah, I know that redlining officially ended in like 68, 69. Guess when the most recent case of redlining occurred? 2015. There's a Jim Crow policy that occurred in 2015. How can we possibly pretend that there's equitable opportunity for everyone when we never even reconciled in reality something as simple and obvious as redlining? We never really wrote that wrong, even when we made it illegal, and then it turned out that people were still doing it anyway. And so I 100% agree. You're not talking about 50 meters behind. I was a track runner, by the way. In a mile race, you have 4 laps of 100 meters. We basically we're as black people are at the 50-meter mark right now. That's where we're at. So I would agree with them that we have to have equitable opportunity if we are going to achieve equitability when it comes to race relations.
Okay. And Karlyn, I know when we've talked about this issue before, you've looked at it from a little bit role of a personal growth. Do you see a couple times what has been mentioned is socioeconomics? Do you see it as all socioeconomic, or how do you see this issue? Is it a goal, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, certainly I think there are socioeconomic realities at play here, but I come from this at an angle of individual empowerment and personal responsibility in these scenarios. Now, I agree with pretty much everything that Justin and Niko just said. But from my perspective, as someone who's coached people in organizations in the workplace, and I've coached many, many, many people of color, the things that set them apart in terms of the ones that are able to create their own opportunities and achieve that success is what's called the success mindset. This is research that's come out of the University of Pennsylvania by a researcher named Michelle Jelen, who basically found that people who are successful have three things. Number one, they have to believe that success is a possibility. And when I think of social justice ideology coming into play and teaching people from a very early age that they are a victim of the system, I think it inhibits them to see success as a possibility. And that, I mean, if you're teaching that to kids, that is almost an impossible perspective to change once they become adults. And I think that really holds them back. The two other things that are responsible for a success mindset are that people are able to see stress as an opportunity rather than something as an obstacle to overcome, and frankly, their ability to just help one another. The more you help one another in your career, the greater your odds of getting a promotion. But I also think in this equation, something that I think about is what is actually the goal? Because I coach executives who are miserable human beings. They may make a lot of money, they may do very well, they may have fancy titles and cars and all this stuff, but they are miserable. And so if the goal is that everyone just makes a lot of money and has that career success, I don't actually think that's what we should be shooting for. I think we should be shooting for happy, fulfilling lives. And of course, financial stability is a part of that, but that comes at many different levels.
Now, Melissa, what do you think? I mean, part of this is mentioned personal growth, happiness, and feeling good. Others mention here about meaningfully involved in the creation of institutional policies. It sounds like politics is a dogfight.
Well,
I mean, who
actually,
wants-
let me go back to your first question. So I did hear the dog whistle. I'm probably maybe it's because I am a dog, but I did hear the dog whistle. That it sounds like, see, that's the difference between equity and equality. Equity, there's a really good quote by Frederick Hayek, who's one of my favorite thinkers of all time, who said that there's all the difference in the world between treating people equally and making everyone equal. And I think equity sounds like the latter. It sounds like, every single disparity between groups has to be sort of attributed to racism or something structural in nature, versus equality is about treating everybody, the same. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. And for a long time, yes, our nation did betray the principles with slavery, with horrible segregation laws, and we made some strides into fixing all of that. And legally now, they're at least in the eyes of the law, all men are created equal. We can say that comfortably now in the law. How that is practiced, how that manifests, and are there legacies of the past that still haunt the present? Sure, I think it's helpful to interrogate that, but I'm always wary of trying to adjust the outcomes so that we have exactly, we look across the board and say we have to have equal representation in everything, or else the explanation has to be that there must be some form of discrimination going on.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that everybody here would agree that what happened to the Jewish people in the Holocaust was absolutely horrid, and that something had to be done to reconcile that, because of just how bad they were being treated in Europe at the time, to no fault of their own whatsoever. And in a country that vehemently disagrees with reparations, for Black people specifically, this is also the same country that vehemently vilifies anyone who talks about the fact that Jewish people got reparations. I mean, and it wasn't just the people who were in the Holocaust, because I know a lot of people will say, well, my family wasn't around during slavery. Well, my ex-girlfriend, for example, she's Israeli, and she came over here, she worked for El Al Airport, got a Social Security card, work visa, and if she would have went to university here, she would have gotten half of her tuition paid as part of the reparations that the United States gives another country. And so no one argues that Jewish people don't deserve some type of reconciliation there. But when it comes to issues of black people or brown people specifically, it's always, well, we don't want to try to adjust for that. But where was that at in 1940 and 1950? Because we had no problem doing it for somebody else. But when it's time to have this conversation about somebody in our country, then it's, oh, well, we're all equal under the eyes of the law. But that's simply not true. I mean, we all are quite aware of what Jim Crow is, and I think we all agree that that's bad, right? Please nod. Please nod. Okay. Do you all know how education is funded? 93% by what?
Property tax.
Property taxes. Wouldn't we all agree that education largely prevents a lot of the problems that we see people of color deal with? It would help at least mitigate those circumstances. But what did I just discuss with you all? The Federal Housing Administration did what? Stopped us from actually having houses that could increase our property value, increase our property, et cetera, et cetera. So how exactly is education getting paid for? Because only 10% of funding comes from the federal government.
Niko, I actually have a question for you, though. And this is because I am very open to the idea of reparations. I think there are a lot of arguments to be made for that. I just don't know what form that comes in. I mean, I think that oftentimes money can actually fix a lot of problems. Are there ways that we can direct money to programs that would encourage more black fathers to stay in the family, or direct it to education, as you've said? I mean, what does reparations look like to you, I guess, is my question.
So you'll get different answers from different people, but I think it has to be a combination of direct cash payments and program investments. But like the direct cash payment, I know some people think of reparations as, well, I have to give money for my taxes for slavery. That reparations, I just told you all, like Jim Crow is literally still here. There is a law right now that is still allowing Jim Crow laws like the way education is funded in 2020. So, did you have a slave? No, probably not. I mean, unless you're, like Pharrell and you're a vampire and you've been here forever. But did you benefit from Jim Crow? Absolutely. When you're looking at redlining, did you benefit from redlining? Absolutely. You actually, in a capitalist society, got to watch your competition be crushed. So was it really a free market? Did we ever have a chance to have a black J.P. Morgan? Did we ever have a chance to have a black Warren Buffett? Have we ever had a chance to have, Oprah is crazy rich. She is nothing compared to the legacy of a lot of these white elites who have had generational wealth that they've been able to flip into more generational wealth. And so what reparations really is saying, well, let's give them a chance to catch up. And this is a debt by society. Whenever you sue someone posthumously, right? Or that somebody gets paid for something that happens to them and then the family sues posthumously, guess what? You pay that family.
Well,
and the taxpayers, if it's against the government, the taxpayers pay the debt. And largely that's to incentivize the taxpayers to make sure that whatever that vulnerable class is, that those events don't happen to them again.
Yeah, and I guess, do you have data to show that direct cash payments would make that difference, though? Because I just think I go to...
There is data.
Hang on, I think I go to like lottery winners who all of a sudden have this extra money, and within a year they've blown all the money because they didn't know how to use it, or maybe they didn't use it in the right way. And again, I'm not actually opposed to these ideas. I think that if we're going to do reparations, though, I would just want to make sure we're investing things that are actually going to benefit people long term.
So here's my issue with that argument, and I'm gonna let you speak. By the way, I saw you, but my issue with that argument is it doesn't matter how they choose to spend their damn money. That's not the argument. Whenever if I go to sue somebody for doing me wrong, or I got in a car accident and it was their fault, does the judge ask me, well, how are you going to spend the money that you win? No, they don't ask me that. Why? Were you in the wrong? Yes or no? Is there a debt owed? However I choose to spend my, and that goes back to your self-accountability argument. If they waste their money, then it is their problem. And guess what? Now the onus is completely off of the people's shoulders. If you feel like, oh, well, I don't want to have to take care. Now the onus is completely off your shoulders because you can argue, you can say, truthfully, we gave them opportunity in the finances to do something better, and they chose not to. But right now, people don't have that choice. They merely have the illusion of choice.
Yeah, so I think there's there might be some reconciliation that we can have between your point to say that we cannot blame everything that everyone does on racism. I think that's inarguably true. But there's also the issue that everything that Niko just said about how systemic racism and institutional racism, whatever you want to call it, and how the history of that has inarguably impacted the racial groups in this country negatively in certain respects, I think that's also inarguable. And so this disconnect, I think, comes from, first I need to ask a question. How many fans, because I know our audience here, how many fans of White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo do we have in the audience? Raise your hands. There we go. There's my fan right there. No, that book is
It's
garbage.
funny because I'm actually not a fan of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, that book is garbage.
For the record, I think
Okay.
one hand went up and it might have been a joke.
Yeah, that book is terrible. My Twitter handle is SJW Debates. I came up with that on purpose, which is why you shouldn't come up with your internet names 3 o'clock in the morning while drunk, by the way. Just a little tip for you there. That book is really terrible because, there's so many... Yeah, don't do it. So there are so many instances in that book where she comes up to a white person and says, like, hey, you said something really, really racist and you should feel bad about it. And then the person gets like, screw you. Like, what? I'm not a bad person. Screw you, and just walks away. And so if she wants to fix racism, she has provided plenty of examples in that book of how not to do it. A lot of this conversation, a lot of the toxicity surrounding this conversation, I think has to do with this framing that to say that you benefited, if you're white, and I'm white, to say that we have, as a group, and we're talking about socioeconomic issues here, we have to talk about groups, it is not really that uncontroversial to say that white people have benefited from a lot of systems that's poo-pooed on people of color in this country. But a lot of people will see that as a personal attack against their character, to say that, you personally stole something. You might as well have been a slave owner. You might as well be the worst person in the world. And no one is going to listen to that. No one is going to take that attack on their character seriously, and they're sure not going to take any sort of constructive criticism after it. So I think what we could do in this panel, and what I hope is, it seems to be going that direction, is stop talking about, I actually want to shift away from individual responsibility in this one instance. It's not, if you're white, it's not your fault that slavery exists, but it shouldn't hurt your feelings to acknowledge that, yeah, these systems did disproportionately impact people of color in this country. They are inarguably in a worse position because of it. Like you talked about, like, how do we fund school systems? For some reason, mostly through property taxes. Well, majority non-white schools, which are also majority low-income schools, receive about less than $1,200, less than $12,000 per year per student. Mostly white schools, almost $14,000. That seems small, $2,000 per student, but that's a big difference. That's a big difference in quality of education. And when you combine that with everything else around it, this is not fair. It's going to sound like I'm whining, but fair and just, I'm all about being fair and just because I'm an American. These are my values. So this doesn't seem fair and just to me, and I'm compelled to want to see it fixed.
And I want to get Melissa in here, but do we know it's the money for sure? Because, Bloomberg spent a ton of money on ads and didn't get much at all. So you wonder if it's just the money. But Melissa, I want to get you in on this. What are your thoughts? Just either to respond or to that question.
Wait, specifically about education or about
Free
individual response?
forum.
Oh, okay. Well, no, actually, I did want to say something about, like what Karlyn was saying about how we actually do this. One of the issues is that when we end up, we're going to end up adjudicating who gets to have reparations, and everything's going to end up being kind of a race tribunal. And one of my concerns is also about this kind of discourse ends up flattening almost everybody into just these categories of race. And it takes a lot of richness and context out of things. Is somebody that immigrated here, there are refugees from the Eastern Bloc, Eastern Europe, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that came into the United States. Their regimes collapsed, and they started from nothing too. How do you compare, to kind of squish everybody into the same category of white and black, is somebody that just immigrated from Nigeria, a wealthy person, right, who immigrate, is that person's experience the same as somebody who's African American and who might have, whose ancestors were enslaved, and how these policies target all these people, whether it's reparations or affirmative action, right? Like it will see these people as like just their color and nothing else. It's just the accident of how much melanin you had in your skin.
I
And
feel
I
like
think that's
it's-
very flattening.
I feel like it's actually not seeing them as just their color. I think that's the problem now is people are being seen as just their color. It's actually validating their experiences and the experiences of their ancestors. And I would agree, a rich person from Nigeria isn't going to have the exact same experience as an African American here. And once again, there are plenty of ways to do. We have zero problem making these distinctions when it comes to the Jewish community. Like we have zero problem with it. But I promise you, in what was the one Oklahoma City massacre, Tulsa, Oklahoma, with Black Wall Street. That was the 60s.
At 95?
No.
What, the Oklahoma City bombing?
No. Oklahoma City massacre for Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street, most successful black city. Yeah, it was like early 1900s, but basically the most successful black city in the country, and they were outpacing the actual Oklahoma City, and they were retaliation because of that. Like, and it wasn't because of all these extenuating circumstances that we use to ignore that they were attacked because of their financial success. Whereas if we look at the Jewish community, we celebrate the fact that they overcame what they dealt with in Europe by banding together, spending their money in their communities, uplifting each other, and we celebrate that. But black people did it too, and they were specifically stopped from doing it because they were black. And if you go into the Jewish community, by the way, you should see how the black Jewish people in Israel are treated. And so just to address your point, if you came from Eastern Europe, if you came from Southeast Asia or East Asia or West Asia, guess what? You could qualify for a loan in the black community and start a business. I couldn't. So once again, it gets down to you can't just lump everybody into, one race or like just pretend like there's not dichotomies within national. But we should not confuse race, nationality, and ethnicity, and we should not conflate like what their oppression was in their country and then how they benefited from unique opportunity because of the systemic racism, the structures that we had in place here that they were then able to take advantage of. So we got, like I said, we just have to acknowledge the reality. Like we can, so some people can get reparations. Cubans basically got reparations in Miami, and now they're the wealthiest Latino group. Specifically, Miami Cubans are the wealthiest Latino group in the entire world from reparations, effectively. So it's that's my point. Is basically
Wait, what do you mean effectively? In what way did they get
they got
reparations?
grants, they got loans. Everybody remembers wet foot, dry foot that Obama eventually repealed, but you were an automatic citizen, and that was like 4 or 5 years ago. This was a thing. Automatic citizen as long as you step foot in this country.
Oh, so you had Cuban privilege because of the boycott, and if you showed up on land, you would get citizenship.
Yeah.
In that way, like a Mexican person crossing the border would not get.
Exactly.
I think one of the challenges around reparations is I think we have different goals with this. And I think that that's okay, by the way. I mean, I think it sounds to me like your goal is payment for a debt owed. And I actually think that's completely valid. I remember when Marianne Williamson said that in the debate, I cheered because I agree with her on that specific point, though I take issue with many other things that she said. But I think that's one goal you could have. How I look at it is, what can we do? What investments that we can make that is going to provide the greatest long-term benefit to the community as a whole? And I'm not sure that direct cash payments are there, but I think that there are many ways that a significant amount of money could be invested that would have real long-term impact. And I'm curious
that
what
actually
those
would
things
be
are.
my goal, but like most people, unfortunately, are inherently selfish, and they're not going to support an idea like that based off of what somebody else could achieve that they may not ever see the benefits
Well, can't we
from.
be ideal for a little bit in the conversation?
I know that'd be nice. But and I agree with you. That should absolutely be the ultimate goal. But once again, I believe in self-determination and self-accountability, and I believe that the black community has proven time and time again they have the ability to figure that out once they get their money, and we've done it. And like I said, just look up massacres, look up the Wilmington massacre if you ever get a chance, and look at what happened there. Oklahoma City massacre, like I was just talking about in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with Black Wall Street. Look at what happened in Berkeley. I mean, this was happening all throughout history, and yet you've never heard about any of it in your history books. And that's why our conversations regarding equity have been so fractured. We're not receiving the same history lessons. No, I thought this was what happened. No, that's not what happened. That's not it. And it's all kind of intertwined with these statute conversations and BLM conversations and police brutality. It's everybody is getting different history. But like when you're talking about things like Oklahoma City and Black Wall Street being massacred because they were financially successful, that's history you can't ignore or pretend. You can't spin it. There is no spin. We know it was during Jim Crow. We know they were segregated. You can't pretend like it's a bunch of white people in black hoods actually protesting and it's not really black people because they wouldn't have been allowed. This happened. It's real. And when we start acknowledging that history and then once again accepting that black people have proven they can be successful when you give them equitable opportunity. And even if you don't give them equitable opportunity, they can still be successful. But the disparities because of the lack of equitable opportunity cannot be ignored also.
Yeah, surprisingly enough, this idea that, wow, we were really terrible to this group of people on the basis of their skin color, maybe we should fix it, is not a new idea. And it's not even an SJW idea. So 50 years ago, the Kerner Commission, which was commissioned by Lyndon B. Johnson, looked at what were the racial disparities, kind of where did they come from, what was the etiology of the extreme gap between, especially like black and white people in this country. And at the end, they found a lot of gaps, surprisingly enough, in the late 1960s, early 70s. Now, this didn't just find gaps, though. It also offered recommendations. So it offered recommendations for massive investments in employment, education, and housing. But Lyndon B. Johnson knew those things wouldn't pass. And because he felt he didn't get enough credit, they didn't pat him on the back enough for the little that he did do, they kind of quashed this report. A follow-up study done 50 years after this report found that really nothing has changed. The same disparities are kind of still there. School segregation has actually increased in the past 20 years. So in 1988, 44% of black children went to majority white schools. In 2018, 20%. Fair Housing Act in 1968 increased black ownership by 6%. Awesome. For some reason, that completely reversed between 2000 and 2015. These problems are still there. All the problems in the civil rights movement that caused all that unrest, they still exist because we never really put the systemic changes in to fix them.
Melissa, do you want to get on this? Some of this doesn't explain to me, and what I'm curious is, like, when you talk about Black Wall Street, like, and you mentioned at that time, like, the black segregated class is actually growing faster and economically than their white counterparts at that time. And Thomas Sowell notes that in the 40s and 50s, the black middle class is growing faster than during segregation with all the major obstacles at that time than they are now. So what's changed? Is there other ways to explain this outside of money being pumped into housing, education, or reparation programs or what? Like, what are your thoughts, Melissa?
Well, actually, so on like education reform, I think that rather than looking at race or sort of trying to fix things based on race, the lens to look at all of this is really class, because this is really about access to education. And a really poor white kid has the same chances of going to a good school as a really poor black kid. And they have more similar struggles and opportunities. So if we fixed the class access to education, wouldn't we in effect be fixing the race issue and more effectively without having to go through tribunals?
So part of that is true. I believe that education is a massive like part of what's going on, which is once again one of the last great Jim Crow law is still in place right now. And so, by the way, what you're saying unfortunately is not true. We do not have the same opportunity to go to Harvard or Yale or et cetera, because that's a culture setter that has to start at the right age. And if you, in the black community, if you were not set on that path, which we have a far less likelihood of being set on for obvious reasons, like just by virtue of, once again, I just said there's no black JP Morgans, there's no black Warren Buffetts, like it's not a thing. And that network also trickles down, or it doesn't.
But do you mean as a whole, like any random black person out of the population has a less chance to get into Harvard, or the same kid, a black kid with a 1,300 SAT and a white kid with 1,300 SAT, you're saying that the black person has a worse chance of getting in Harvard?
Oh man, you're showing your age right now. Nobody with a 1300 SAT score is getting to Harvard. but in all seriousness,
I'm definitely the least hip on stage, so,
So-
I'll take that.
So if they both had like 2100 SAT scores, let's just say, they both have a decent chance. Actually, the black kid at that point will have a better chance of getting to Harvard. But that's because it's so rare for a black kid to get a high score on the SAT to that degree, because the SAT, like the LSAT, is about studying. But I can't study if I have to work 2 jobs, because my mom didn't inherit any generational wealth, because she's still paying rent on a place that we've lived at for 15 years, and she will never own it. But she can't afford a house. So if you have the comfortability of a 2-parent household, which we can get into a little bit later, and I have a single mother, which is what I had, like, I was lucky enough to have the structure at my school, because my debate coach really he took me in and embraced me, white conservative male actually, and when I would go home from work, which would be about 9 p.m., he would open the library for me to use the computer because I didn't have internet access. That's what it took for me to get to and go into the military. But I went to University of North Carolina, but it took a series of very fortunate events. But I will say this too, to wrap up the education thing. I know that everybody wants to go back to class, and I know that this is a huge thing on the populist right? Everything, we just address class. This whole thing is like a car. Class is the engine. You can have the most beautiful, most loud, just an awesome engine. Guess what? Race is your alternator. You don't fix your alternator, your car doesn't run. Gender is your battery. Your battery doesn't work, it doesn't run. If you don't fix every problem and acknowledge every problem on your vehicle, it doesn't matter how much horsepower you have, you're not going anywhere. And it is not a coincidence that every time something happens to the black working class, eventually the white working class feels it too.
Why is race our alternator, though? Like, or is it? I mean, I
It's not
haven't
like
changed my oil in my car in like 15,000 miles, so like, I'm probably not going to like get these things fixed. What is it? Because we've brought these more to the forefront. I mean, I know, Justin, we argue about this plenty. That I'm saying the same obstacles that are facing the kid getting into Harvard, right, with the 13 or 2100 SAT, like those obstacles are the same, because they might have to have 2 extra jobs. I suspect both would get scholarships, but why is it the alternator? Like, I know we have this talk too.
Oh, sorry.
But you can pop back in.
Last time I went to the mechanic, I had to ask if the alternator was full. So I'm just going to skip the metaphor.
That's funny.
Yeah. So class is a big issue, and there's a lot of overlap between black and white poverty. But the fact is, just because there's overlap doesn't mean they're the same. Black people are just way more likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty, areas of poverty where at least 40% of the people living there are under the poverty line. White people just aren't as likely to live in that, and they're also more likely to live in closer to the inner city.
But if you hailed from one of those areas that was in white poverty, and you think, I hear all this rhetoric all the time, but it doesn't apply to me, I'm ticked. Do you get that?
Well, yeah, but that gets back to what we were talking about, like personal responsibility. So I did grow up in that really poor white area. I grew up in a really tiny town in eastern Kentucky that's just been decimated by the loss of coal mining jobs. We were on welfare for all the way through my life, especially after my dad had an accident. We had to get on disability, and the reason I got to go to college was because I got really lucky, and like I just had good grades without ever really trying. I'm not going to pretend I worked for that, because I didn't. And we had enough scholarship money, enough keys money, enough like money just given to me out of the kindness of the government's heart in order for me to pursue an education and actually make it out of there. Most people didn't. And the fact of the matter is that those poor schools just aren't very good. In addition to just not having enough money to get textbooks that don't still use some really questionable words when we're talking about race, and that have covers on them, the education just isn't there. So I think out of a class of about 108, 5 of us went to a big R1 university. And so me and one of my best friends at the time showed up to university. We showed up to our first calculus course, and we take the first test, and we sit down with the results. We were the best math students in our entire all-white poor school. I got a 47. She got a 33, and then she dropped out. We were the best math students in that school. We did not get the education. So the quality of these schools just weren't up to snuff and did not prepare us. And set us back a really long time. Now imagine, in addition to growing up really poor, now imagine you grow up surrounded by crime, surrounded by way more people, or just surrounded by people because you live in Eastern Kentucky, you have to drive 15 miles to your nearest neighbor. Now imagine you live in an inner city where there's a lot more to go on. So yeah, class is really important, and they have a lot of the same issues, and there's a lot of overlap, but there's just, you have to acknowledge other differences.
Now, this would apply also to Asian Americans as well, right? I mean, if you watch the movie Tombstone, Sheriff Behan says proudly that he's president of the Anti-Chinese League,
Well,
right? Who all gets access to this? Because obviously people had different starting points.
Well, but okay, so I want to address what you
Yeah,
just said
go ahead.
about the billionaire situation, like where are the black Warren Buffetts, and also about the point that going to Harvard is not just about good grades; it's about a set of cultural like a set of it's cultures, access to a certain lifestyle, and access to certain mentors maybe that can place you in a way to get into Harvard. I understand that, but wouldn't you say that I think many immigrants that do, move to this country start out completely from scratch. They have no connections to pretty much anyone in this country. There's no, tie Warren Buffett either. They've in fact pretty much severed, their financial connections back home. And to what extent what I'm saying is like everyone kind of brings hardship. Like there is a hardship story to a lot of immigrants' lives. And how does that play into sort of adjudicating this particular hardship versus other people's hardships?
So like I said earlier, you can come here with nothing, or you could have come here with absolutely zero. But yet, my grandmother, who's lived in America her entire life in her neighborhood, she wouldn't qualify for, if she wanted to start a business to help build up her neighborhood. No. She qualified for the loan, let me say that. But she would be denied the loan, but your family would be granted it. This is where the whole idea of the model minority comes from. And so that actually ends up being used against, well, no, look at what the Asian community has been able to do. Yeah, but they don't tell you the Asian community wasn't being denied loans. The Asian community wasn't being denied mortgages. They weren't, and to this day, black people are subject to what's called the metropolitan credit score. Till this day, my brother just bought a Tahoe a year ago and almost walked out with his check because they tried to give him a 4.7% loan interest rate when he has a 780 credit score. I mean, it was a hot, contentious thing that I literally had to calm my brother down because he couldn't understand it. I was like, this is the reality we live in. And so when you can go to my neighborhood and build up your family and build up your wealth and your equity and your assets, but I'm still stuck renting my home, I'm still stuck working for somebody, maybe even working for you, how can I catch up? I mean, it also has to, when we're talking about immigration, we have to realize what our policies are as far as who we consider refugees and who are actually refugees. We considered the Cuban immigrants in Miami, for example, refugees, but in actuality, if you look at your history, no, these were the wealthy class of the Cubans in the United States, or excuse me, in Cuba at the time. They were the ones who were benefiting from the segregation that was happening in Cuba at the time. And they didn't like the fact, I mean, obviously the whole revolution was a problem for them, but the reality when you distill it is they were the ones benefiting from the wealth that we were creating for Cuba. Is a long story, but basically the regime before Fidel, Batista, we propped up. And if you look at around that same time, as a lot of countries that were dominated by people of color were fighting to disband the apartheid on behalf of Nelson Mandela and the Africans in South Africa, guess what we were doing? We were fighting on behalf of the apartheid. Yeah. That was us. And so when you think about our foreign policy from that aspect, you go to Miami right now, you would think that there were no such thing as black Venezuelans or Colombians. You would think there's no such thing, except for when you look at the countries and where they're at. Cuba's 70% black now. Venezuela's full of mestizos and negritos and all and indigenous. That is who makes up their countries, which is why those revolutions tend to be successful. So now that's why if some people are kind of confused why Miami is Cuban and Republican, even though they're pretty liberal in their behavior. Well, that's because those type of administrations were the ones who were inviting them in while simultaneously telling you Mexico's sending over their worst, but Cuba sent over their best.
Well,
How
part
did
of that
that
had
work?
to be communism versus capitalism too, right? The other side.
So communism versus capitalism was definitely a dog whistle. It was. It is. I think, look at the facts. It's literally the reason that the people, you can complain about Maduro, you can complain about Fidel Castro, you complain about who's Evo Morales in Bolivia, but the reason they're able to stay in the power is because of the democratic makeup of their nation, primarily being people of color and poor people also. And so the ones who come here are the blonde hair, blue eyes, the ones who are basically ousted, if you will, denied their quote unquote opportunity because whenever that socialist regime went in, they started holding them accountable for the corruption they were indeed participating in. And they come to America to escape accountability because that is our culture. And they know that. And that's why Cubans are given automatic citizenship with web foot, dry foot, but Mexicans, they're rapists all of a sudden.
So I don't want to jump into the communism versus capitalism thing. I want to go back to Harvard for a second. And I guess I want to ask, why is going to Harvard even the goal? Why is that even the goal? I mean, that's a socialist construct as much as anything else. And if you look at the research, 50% of the students at Harvard, actually it's greater than 50%, are clinically depressed. They're clinically depressed because they are constantly striving after that next goal instead of appreciating what they have. They are at Harvard. They have every resource available to them when they're actually allowed to be on campus. And why would you be depressed in that environment? Well, it's because that every one of those students was in the top 1% of their class. Their achievement was their happiness. And they get to Harvard, and guess what? Only 1% of them are going to graduate in the top 1% of the class at Harvard. And so if they don't get there, then they're not good enough. And then guess what? The next thing is getting that big job, getting that big car, getting that big title, getting that house, getting that family. They're constantly striving instead of just appreciating what we have. And I think from my perspective, again, my goal is that people lead happy lives. It's not about money. It's not about stuff. It's not about materialism. I thought a lot about, visiting Peru, and not like touristy Peru, but like very rural Peru, where people are living in literal huts. But they have a very high quality of life, and they're happy, and their kids are running around, and the community takes care of them. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that's what we want here, but I gotta say, there was moments when I was there that I was like, what am I even doing? Why don't I live like this? Because these people seem so happy. And another thing I think about, coming back to education, and because I went to a very poor school as well. I had 48 people in my high school graduating class. About 5 of us went to college. But one thing that I've been looking a lot into is programs in inner city Baltimore. It's actually a program started by 2 Black men where they go into the schools in Baltimore and teach young kids mindfulness and meditation. And every single day, everyone in the class does deep breathing twice a day, and every single person in the class does yoga. And when kids get in trouble, they aren't punished, they don't get detention. They go to the mindfulness room and they have to do deep breathing and learn to work through the conflict. And what's happened there is their suspension rates have basically gone to 0. Their behavioral problems have dramatically reduced, and their attendance has dramatically increased. And this is happening at a very, very young age. And I have to think that there's some there in terms of, if we can instill this personal responsibility in people that young, then we're going to set them up for greater success, because we've created the internal security inside of them where they know that they have everything they need to be successful. And yes, there are obstacles in front of them, and everyone starts from a different place in life, but they have everything they need to be able to do what it takes to overcome that and achieve whatever is going to make them happy.
2 points. I think the reason why people want to go to Harvard is because we've created a world of credentialism, right? So you have to check this box to get to the next spot, to get to the very next one.
Except that that's all bullshit.
Well, yeah, clearly. I mean, you can look at how our elite class is right.
Some of
Like
the dumbest
George
people I
W.
know
Bush
went to
has
Ivy League. Like some of the dumbest people I know went to Ivy League schools.
I think you're
Okay,
gonna
but that's
get,
that
I think you're gonna get the hardest overall panel agreement on that question right there. Yeah.
probably. But,
Colleges are for credentialization. Yeah.
Well, the second thing I wanted to say is, you talked about this line, this 50 meters behind. There are so many other things that kind of, cause people to start behind. Like, for example, things that you didn't choose, like height, like your looks, or, things like just birth order, something as random as that these are all things that kind of happen to you. And I wonder if this is also something that, we should correct for? I mean, if at the end of the day, like, we're concerned about equity and everybody having the same opportunities, like, you know, are we going to correct for everything and make sure everybody kind of, you know, starts from exactly the same place?
Well, I mean, like, I don't know if we can correct height. I don't know if we can correct birth order.
There's surgery for that. Just letting everybody know.
You know what? There is, but like until that happens, until we're like on the full like cyberpunk utopia, until that happens, I'm not sure that's a super great comparison because we can fix a lot of these
No, but
systemic
it's implicit
issues.
bias. It's the same thing. The reason why taller people are paid as CEOs, right? Like, it's because of implicit bias.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
not,
it's
but it's not
structural.
but it's not just implicit bias. I mean, Black people definitely face implicit bias, and arguably in all institutions. I have a lot of data in front of me that I did a whole lot of research for this, but also like it's everybody here agrees that the history of systemic racism and inarguably racist policies have put them so far back, and we can fix that. We can invest. We can do all those investments that the Kerner Commission recommended way back in the 1960s. We can invest heavily in education. We can invest heavily in housing projects. We can invest heavily in these community organizing programs. Maybe we even like do things like do mindfulness, do things with data-driven results behind them. We can do that way easier than we can switch someone's birth order or fix implicit
No,
bias.
we're not
about
trying to
height.
fix that. It's the same. It's the same policies. Like, you know, if there are differences in group outcome, we're going back to look at policies and saying, okay, this is how we're going to fix that. You don't have to fix
So,
the
I
original.
mean, we should though.
so I want to say this. So your Harvard question, which by the way is a very thoughtful one, and I agree the goal shouldn't necessarily be getting to Harvard. But if you ask me and most people, it's not about getting to Harvard, but I damn sure deserve the same opportunity to get into Harvard as everybody else. That's what it's about. And that's what most people from the time they're born don't have. And I would say this, there are obviously for whatever reason, people don't like admitting I think people kind of feel like, everyone wants to feel like everything they've ever achieved is because of their own efforts. It's bullshit. We've all gotten lucky, and we're all limited by our experiences. But I will tell you this, if you were raised in a poor white community and you did not succeed for whatever reason, or you didn't get the job, it wasn't because you were Black or because you were white in y'all's case. If for example, something as traumatizing that happened to me, I dated a Korean woman in high school and her dad was racist as hell, and I was kind of insulated in high school, very fortunately, honestly, because I don't even know if I would have been able to handle it, but basically, we did not know racism was as prominent as it was, but her dad was older style. He was racist and basically told me I can't date his daughter because I was Black, and I couldn't believe it. But I can almost guarantee you've never been told I'm not dating you, or my parents don't approve of you. Why? Because you're white and they think you're a thug. You've never been denied an opportunity, a true opportunity, because of your race. And that's the difference. I may have been given an opportunity that a white person may not have been given because, like, just given it to, like, bestowed upon me because of being Black, because we have different institutions and things like that that kind of help with that now. But the difference is I've also been denied opportunities specifically and only because I'm Black. And until we just simply acknowledge this, and that's the problem once again. It's there's all the issues that you're talking about. I can't do anything about you being short. I can't do anything about the order you were born in. I can't do anything about those things. But the things that we can reconcile, we absolutely should. And once again, our country has shown whenever it's time to do it for somebody else, like once again, with Israel, most of the right and even a lot of the left have no disputes about all the benefits. So why do the Jewish community of Israel, they get reparations? Cubans got reparations.
Wait, how do they get reparations?
So they get. I mean, we give
Do
them
you mean from
billions
Europeans
of
or
dollars.
Americans?
Yeah.
We give them billions of dollars a year. Billions, like
you're
tens
But
of
what do you
billions,
mean?
actually.
Yeah. What does that mean?
He means like American investment in
No,
Israel, arms aid, and all the money that we
Arms
do give to
aid,
Israel.
education,
Israel.
job
Right.
opportunity. I just said my she worked for El Al. Because of that and her connection to Israel, she got a Social Security card the moment she stepped on American soil got a half
But
a
that's not
full ride
reparations.
to any American
But is
university
that
in the country.
reparations? I mean, we also give Australia money. We give Bolivia money.
No, no,
and
no,
we
no.
fund a ton of things. That's
We
not-
giving aid because we have a bilateral agreement is one thing, but we fought for the creation of Israel and we justify all the money we give them. And while we don't invest in our own communities and our own infrastructure, specifically because of the Holocaust, that's reparations.
So, Niko, I want to go back to something you just said a minute ago, that white people are never denied something because of their race. 6 months ago, I would have 100% agreed with you. Except that now I have at least half a dozen clients that I know of I've had private conversations with their HR people who have told me we are only hiring black people now. Now, that's not official because they can't do that. That's illegal. They get sued. But I have had many conversations where they are specifically denying people
And-
opportunities because of their race.
And
Now, that's an overcorrection.
Now, here's the thing, though. What are the odds they can just go to another job, apply for the same position, and get it, and they won't be denied because of their race?
And well, maybe.
And so
but
that's
don't
what I
even-
mean by I don't mean you got denied a job that's because of affirmative action kicked in at some point. That's not what I mean. I mean being denied the opportunity to pursue something you're passionate about or you love, like as a whole, because of your race. There are dreams that are given up on in our community every single day. Out of everybody that I grew up with, and I still talk to them because iMessage is amazing and we have group chats. The only difference between where I was going and where they ended up now is my debate coach, who came from a pretty successful family, who understood also why I was on the path that I was on, who was very patient with me. He took me and dragged me out of my situation and put me on a better path. That was that little difference put me in a position where I own my own company, and my friends can barely afford to pay. A couple of them have been to
But
jail a
is that
couple of times.
privilege to have a mentor like that then?
Oh, absolutely. But it was luck. It was luck and fortune. I ended up going to a really nice school, and I was only able to stay at that school when they gentrified the area because I ran track, did debate, and played soccer. And so because I was athletic, I got the benefit from that. And because he was at that nice school and we had a good debate team, I was able to take advantage of that. But if I would have not played any of those sports, or if I was one street over, or my mom couldn't take me to school, I'm at one of the worst schools in the district.
Yeah, I guess I
It's
just
that
don't think
small.
it is an employer's responsibility to give you individual empowerment and resiliency. I think that's the individual's responsibility. And if someone gives up on their dreams when they could keep trying and could keep pushing, I'm sorry, that's their fault.
Okay.
And this is why, excuse me,
Go ahead.
this is why I think it is very important to instill in every child from a very young age personal empowerment and responsibility. And this is why I like these programs in Baltimore so much, where they're doing just that, because those kids are going to grow up knowing, yes, I may be told no sometimes, I may not get my way sometimes, but if I keep pushing, if I keep trying, I can do it. And
So-
I'm going to find people who will give me that opportunity.
As a child, I just really want to answer this. As a child, it is very easy to stay that motivated. As a child, imagine being 13 and 14-year-old and you see your mom working 2 jobs and you have to eat ramen noodles.
I did that
there was a
too, man.
3-day stint that I can just distinctively remember in my mind where we had bread, sugar, and honey for 3 days straight, and that's all we could afford to eat. And imagine being 14 as a young male, and you're not upset because you don't have money to eat or you can't afford to eat and that you're eating. You're upset because you're watching your mom break down in tears because of everything that she has to deal with because of what society does to not only black, but black women specifically. And now you have just a natural instinct to provide for that family, and it doesn't matter if I have to go to the corner to do it. I don't feel like I have opportunity. That's why I do. You think I'm going out on the corner if I think one day I might get into Harvard, but let me just sell this dime bag of weed real quick and potentially put all of that in jeopardy despite having no. That's why you don't see it as often in white, wealthy communities, at least not openly, because they have opportunity and they're not going to risk it for something as silly as that. But I'll risk, and many people have gone to jail, I'll risk anything to put, and I'm sure most of you all would feel the same way, right? You risk anything to put food on the table for your family. Anybody would. And
So-
that's no different when you see somebody on the street trying to do that, even if it was considered illegal at the time.
So we're going to go to Q&A in a second, but I just want to get Justin and you sounded like it's something to add.
Yeah, so all that individual empowerment, I love that program that you described, especially if there's empirical data to support it. That's fantastic. That's great, and we should instill that you can overcome any challenges in your life to kids, especially on an individual level. But when we're talking about societal problems, we can't just think, well, individuals should just make better choices. No societal problem has ever been fixed by just like expecting individuals to individually choose to individually make a better choice. And so when you grow up with this like ethos that I can do whatever I want, everything I do is up to me, that can be empowering, but can also be really damaging in certain ways. So I'm sure you're aware of a lot of this research, and you hit the nail on the head in terms of what a lot of the research in psychology says. We vastly overestimate our impact on our own lives. Like one of the best examples that I can think of off the top of my head is like a really classic experiment. Like, I'm going to flip a coin for you. What's it going to land on? Okay, now I want to give you the coin, and people will think that they have a better chance of getting what they want if they flip the coin themselves. And that's a really simple way, but it's been replicated in like actual real world studies too. And so like, when you end, a lot of this conversation is just focused way too much on individual people. So you're blaming individual people for being racist, or you're blaming individual black people for growing up in an environment that's like, and you didn't make the correct choices. And so when you start to develop that, you start to think, well, I just got told by somebody that they're not hiring white people anymore. Like, there's the real systemic racism against white people. Your individual story is not the whole broader picture. You can't paint a picture of society like that. What you do is you get data. You get, anybody here heard of like it's like a really famous study, you might have heard of it, like, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? Pretty familiar study. Well, there's a meta-analysis done of studies like that, of 28 field experiments consisting of 56,000 applications to 26,000 different positions, and white people got callbacks with the exact same resume. White-sounding names, white people got callbacks 36% more than black people. That is what systemic racism looks like. That is what systemic implicit bias looks like. If your individual job said that, okay, we're not going to hire white people anymore, it sucks. That's not representative of the societal problems that we're actually talking about and actually trying to address.
Justin, doesn't it seem a little bit cold? Like, for example, if a white or a black family had a kid that had tie socks, for example, and then you said, well, it's mostly in the Jewish community. It's not really prevalent in black and white communities much. So there. You know, that's not much. It seems like if an individual white person or Asian person or whomever loses something because of an affirmative action, to say then, but mostly as white people you don't face this, doesn't it seem cold?
Yeah, it's like, if you're talking on, don't go up to an individual like person in general and say like, your problems don't matter. And like point to like, did you know there's still slavery? Your problems don't matter. I don't care about that. No, that's a horrible thing to do, especially talking on a person-to-person level. But if you are discussing societal problems, you got to talk like societal like data, and societal prescriptions.
And I think what I'm worried about in this is, frankly, not just the white people who are being denied jobs because of their race. Because I think you're right. These are cases of my individual clients. I don't know that this is a larger problem. What I am worried about is a dramatic overcorrection on this issue. There needs to be balance. I fully agree with you that there are systemic problems that we should be taking care of, that we can make investments in, but it's got to be a balance, and we can't go to the extreme other end, because that's recreating the same problem all over again.
Well, we'll worry about going to the extreme other end when we've even sort of kind of approached the middle.
Well, we are when we're discriminating against people because of their race.
Hey, remember
hiring.
that meta-analysis of all the studies that I said? We are doing that. It's just not going that direction.
If we were as worried about, like, actually, once again, not discriminating against black people as we were about not discriminating against white people for something they may have not been directly involved in 400 years ago, we wouldn't have to have these conversations. That's the funniest part about, you're like, well, because I understand the context of the conversation. You're like, well, the white people were da-da-da-da-da. Well, the truth is, nobody but us have made the argument, that same argument for black people, and then when we talked about it, it immediately became a class thing. And that's what the problem is. It always is something else. It can never just be what the facts say it is, even though I just explained and people kind of just have casually ignored it. I just said we have Jim Crow laws that are still here that were specifically created to oppress and suppress black success, and we just casually gloss over it. But let's focus more on the fact that white people struggle too. Nobody is saying white people don't
All right,
get
cool.
discriminated against.
So I just want to make sure we're not discriminating against the audience here because I'm getting some pieces that were supposed to be for Q&A. So come up to the microphone and you can fire away here.
Hey there, guys. My name is Adam. And so my family is one of those immigrants from Eastern Europe. My grandparents were in Nazi concentration camps, and my other grandfather was in also Soviet Gulag. And our country was under severe oppression under Hitler's National Socialistic Workers' Party and under Stalin's Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So we dealt with a lot of hardship and oppression. Now, when you talk about black people starting at the 50-meter line behind, Poland started at the 1,000-mile mark behind because of how badly our country was destroyed. 20% of our population was decimated. Over 50% of our population was wounded by World War II. We've had our industry taken over by Stalin, all these other things that happened to us. But yet we somehow persevere because the culture that exists in this country allows us to do that. I don't demand reparations from Germany for what happened to us from Germany. I don't demand reparations from Russia from what Russia did to us. I only demand that they stop, and that's it. No money, you don't need to give us, just allow us to work. That's it. And we've changed significantly. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Poland had a GDP per capita of only 1,700. Right now, it's at 15,000. And that came from hard work, despite the fact that we were decimated. On top of that, we spent a lot less than black Americans on education because we're still a poor developing country. Black Americans, you say, get $12,000 per year. We only spend about $3,300 because that's about what we could afford. Yet our PISA scores on the Program for International Student Assessments are significantly higher with fewer resources. I think a lot more has to do with culture, okay, than simply focusing on the past, because we prefer to be more future-oriented rather than past-oriented and demanding Germany and Russia pay for everything.
Cool. So we're taking that as a comment or a question? It's well thought out and set up.
That's
Well,
more
I think
of
that's
the-
is
I think
culture
there's-
more
yeah.
important than the other factors that we were discussing. And I would say, yeah, and that's easy to all unify behind a common goal when you all went through the exact same thing and you all basically look exactly alike and have lived the exact same experiences, and you've never had one group enslave another group or create laws against another group.
Muslims enslaved us in the 1600s with the Ottoman Empire.
No, but
We had
we're
more
not talking about.
Muslims
But we're not
enslaved
talking about
white
the. But we're
Polish
not
people
talking about the
than the black
1600s. We're talking about 1900 to 2000. There are still Jim Crow laws that originated from slavery. Is what I'm saying.
Soviet
Like the
Union occupied us
people.
till 1991.
Say that again.
The Soviet Union occupied us till 1991.
But
that was more recent than Jim Crow laws.
But once again, there are Jim Crow laws in the country that I live and was forced to live in, and I really can't go to another. I mean, I can, but it's like a whole process. But this country of opportunity that I'm supposed to live in. Once again, we got to be consistent here. We have no problem, and I get your argument, but then why is everybody so casually fine with reparations to other groups that the American elite want to protect? But then when we get to the conversation about black people, but what about what my people went through? All Polish people have, just generationally have dealt with, it doesn't really matter what your religion was. Polish people didn't go up to Hitler and be like, hey, just letting you know, not Jewish. I know it didn't work like that. However, when I walk down the street, my perception of you, in this country anyway, isn't, wow, that's a fine-looking Polish fellow. Because race isn't, and the issues that come from that, isn't a matter of what I want people to see me as. It's their distinct, just visceral reaction based off of societal implications that basically say, I see you as this because this is what I've been trained to see you as, and everything that comes with that. So when you look different, you're gonna have different outcomes. And when you have one group that has shared experiences, of course they're gonna be able to band together a little bit easier.
Saying focus on the culture and not the past is like saying focus on the math instead of the numbers. Where does culture come from? If you were to study culture, what would you study if not the past? Past makes culture. Previous events make culture. An entire group of unified people going through a terrible situation and then banding together in order to fix it. That sounds like a highly motivated group of people. Why? That is not like just going through something bad. There's so many other variables to consider before you realize. Before you just say I had it hard and I made it. Like there's so much other stuff to consider.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to consider. I'd like to read something. Thank you, by the way. This is a great panel. I'm so happy to have this panel. And I'm so happy because one of the things I like about this panel is that you guys got my heart racing. So so that's a good panel.
Right? It's not just the Adderall.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to read you something, and I'd like to get comments on this. This is from Forbes, and it's dated August 14th, 2020. The Justice Department said Yale University has discriminated against Asian American and white applicants, issuing its finding roughly 2 years after opening an investigation. The department said Thursday that it found that Yale discriminates based on race and national origin, violating federal civil rights law, and that race was the determinative factor in hundreds of admissions decisions each year. It said that for the majority of applications, Asian American and white students have 1/10 to 1/4 the likelihood of being admitted as African American applicants with comparable academic credentials. This is systemic racism. That's not systemic racism.
How many black people go to Yale? That's out
Well,
of curiosity.
I don't know, but apparently
I mean,
they have,
I feel like that's
that's
kind of
not
if you're
the
talking about the
discussion.
rate, how many black people are even applying
that
to
is
Yale?
not the question. The question is this, my question
Okay.
is this racism good? Should it continue? And should it be expanded?
No.
Racism
That-
is never good.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
racism, and it shouldn't be considered, and it should not be continued. That should be addressed. But, and this is what, and you know what? I hope you can appreciate me, the SJW, the big lefty up here, being honest and saying that no, that is inexcusable. We shouldn't do that. Now, I hope that you would be honest and say that how many students go to Yale?
I don't know.
You
I
want
don't
to
know,
guess?
but-
Hold on. Yeah, you want to go?
Sure,
should we-
I'll say 5,000 students a year.
Okay, now how many people are in the United States?
375 million.
So you think that maybe that this one instance can absolutely be racist, even favoring people of color, and also maybe on a societal level we can have systemic racism still?
It's actually the second university that's had this problem. Harvard has the same problem.
Two.
So
Okay.
two, yeah, two.
Man, those are
two-
some nice problems to have.
Two
Listen,
affecting thousands and thousands of children.
And yeah,
based
two Ivy
on-
League schools, by the way.
You're not. You shouldn't be dismissing what I'm saying here.
No, we're not
I
dismissing
acknowledge
it.
Shouldn't be
acknowledge
dismissing
what you
I'm saying.
said.
This
Hold
is
on, acknowledge that.
discrimination. This is racism.
But you
This
have
is
to.
Children.
But so how
Hold on a
many?
second. This is children being denied opportunity because of the color of their skin. This is disgusting, putrid shit.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, we agree
There
that
were like
racism
20
it should
kids.
be ceased. But at the same time, once again, you didn't answer my question, which is kind of an important part. How
Okay.
many black kids are applying to Yale every year?
Are
don't know.
you just saying contention that while you concede that this is a problem, what David
It's
is putting
absolutely a problem.
but the problem that you're talking about is considerably bigger. Is that
Well,
your
it's
contention?
a matter.
You don't
It's
have
literally a
numbers for
matter
that,
of.
though.
I mean, I've been to Yale campus several times. I've been to Princeton's campus. I've been to Harvard's campus. Listen, when I tell you, there are plenty of white and Asian Americans there, and there are very little to no black. So, like, whenever you hear like discrimination, I'm like, okay, discrimination in favor of who? Because you're never just discriminating against one group. There has to be someone who is receiving the positive benefits of that.
Well, this is discrimination in favor of African Americans.
I have a-
But how many African? So once again, it goes back to my question. You would have to be a bit for me to think this is like a serious problem, like that it's affecting the outcome of the overall success of those races. You would have to basically tell me I go to Yale campus and I'm seeing 50% of the population being black.
But you're
So
looking at-
that's
at
where the line
race
is?
level,
I
but
do
he's
have a
looking
question
at
for
the
you.
individual
Racism
level.
is bad.
Hang on, can
But
can the girl speak for a second?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I think racism is always a serious problem, and it doesn't really matter which group it's affected to. But I mean, honestly, my answer to this question is people have got to stop putting Ivy League schools on a pedestal as the ultimate educational achievement. That is the answer.
But it's happened in
I
other
think
places
the answer is
too, though.
elimination of discrimination, and people should be able to go to the schools that they want to. And if you want to go to Harvard and get a great education, you should be able to do that without being badmouthed. It's fine to want to go to Harvard. It's fine to want to go. It's fine to study your ass off to go to Harvard. And it's horrible being a person who was raised with a mother who punished me every time I got bad grades. Being a person who did not get leniency in my grades.
By the way, but it's not just Harvard. It's actually, it's UT Austin. It's
Yeah.
other. It's
You know,
other.
but
This is really awful
Oh, no,
stuff
no, it's
here,
okay.
and this is real current systemic racism.
There are two really important things I wanted to point out about that exchange just now. Now, if you were to tell me that story, so yes, if you were to tell me that story in a vacuum just now, and I were to come up in response to that and say, 50 kids died yesterday, and you're worried about You're worried about like people not getting into Harvard? What is wrong with you? You would recognize that for what it is, which would be whataboutism. You're trying to divert the question. So when we're on a panel about racial equality, and it is inarguable that we have immense racial disparities in this country. I have 1,000 studies saying that we have, not 1,000, but I have a ton of studies saying we have implicit bias right now. And there are a ton of historical studies done that say that historical racism is the reason for these racial disparities. If you were to come up and say, well, what about these two schools that make up 0.0001% of the population, you would recognize that as whataboutism. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, and it does not mean that we shouldn't acknowledge that in this instance, it is terrible.
No, but it's an example, though, of what we're talking about. Like, because the question really was, what are the obstacles to racial inequity, right? And the question is, do we use racial inequity to fight racial inequity? Because this is the subtext of that conversation.
Yes.
But that's not
Wait,
racial. But that's
kinda.
also not racial inequity because if in the same breath, which is I hear that story a lot, by the way, because I heard it in 2016, 2017 too, and I still had a problem with that because I'm against racism in all of its forms, and I think every form of racism should be addressed, right? It is not a matter of like, and I firmly believe that. Now, in that same breath, UCLA got caught discriminating against black people, and 70% of their entire undergraduate population is Asian. Did you know that? 70%. 70%. You know how good of a job and how much opportunity you can get from going to UCLA, but when we're looking at discrimination, that's one of the top 3 schools in the country for public schools. Harvard's obviously one of the top schools in the country for private schools, and so is Yale. So now you have to address, well, how do we make sure we don't have to discriminate, that there is not even an incentive to discriminate against an Asian person or a white person in favor of a black person? We address systemic racism in general. So now we all have the same opportunity and we all get to work just as hard to hopefully get the same outcome. But I don't care about the same outcome. I care about the opportunity to have the same outcome.
I just want to point out that we spent months during the impeachment trial listening to the Democrats talk about how they could walk and chew gum at the same time. We can
No, they can't. They're lying to you.
solve more than one problem at a time. And we can talk about systemic racism, and we can also talk about discrimination occurring at places like Harvard and Yale against white and Asian applicants. We can do 2 things at once, and one doesn't necessarily have to be deemed.
Oh yeah, we can.
That's what I just said.
more than
Yeah,
the
we
other.
can absolutely do
Yeah,
2
that's what I
things
just
at once.
said.
It's just it seems weird.
No. You can literally do both. I agree. That's what I just said. If you want to solve one, you actually have to address the other instead of pretending like it's not as big of a deal because the other one happened, if that makes sense. Oh, well, it's not as big of a deal because look at what happened to these white people in this one random instance. Yeah, I agree. That's wrong, and we should make sure that never happens. Now, how do we get to that point?
Well, let's put out the next question.
All right, so there's been a lot of talk about distributing the resources and how the resources have been distributed. And I find it, and we've also talked a bit about like culture may or may not play a role in that. So I'm very interested in this question because we're looking at the disparity of groups and saying, well, this is because this group got reparations, this group did not get reparations, and we're implicit behind that is like, well, why is America a more wealthy country than other countries? So I'm very curious in the question of are all cultures equal in the making of wealth? And when we're talking about like the success of Israel or the success of Cuban Americans, is that purely because they got reparations, or is there some sort of cultural factor in there, or what's going on with that? And also, just in general, is there any trade-off here between like the desire? Because we talked about equality and equity. Is there any trade-off between having equal outcomes and then not having people and killing the engine that's creating all the wealth in the first place?
So it really needs to just be understood that when you're talking about America in general, our wealth is ill-gotten. We rob, we pillage. I mean, literally, our former CIA director said, we lied, we cheated, we stole. A lot of the wealth that Cuban Americans just explained, once again, I feel like I have to keep saying this, we literally were not allowed to create wealth for ourselves. It has zero to do with culture. Zero. And then, of course, some of us eventually were allowed to create a business, a small business or something like that in our community or in a nearby community. But then, guess what? We're now a whole 3, 4, 5 generations behind, and gentrification happens. So now I finally get a chance to maybe eventually catch up after I pass my business down and maybe a home down to my kids, except for because all these other people were building up generational wealth. At the same time, I was denied the opportunity to create generational wealth for my family. You can now buy any opportunity I was finally about to get. That's once again why we have to reconcile. If we want to stop having to have these conversations, why not just spend the damn money to fix the problem? That's
Melissa,
it.
what do you
That's
think?
all we have to do.
Cultural?
Well, no. So firstly, I actually disagree that our wealth was ill-gotten in a way. If you look at the S&P 500, the companies right now with the highest market caps are companies that were just started in the last 20 years. You're looking at Sergey Brin and Larry Page out of their own garage. You're looking at Mark Zuckerberg out of a Harvard dorm. These are companies that did not exist, and they're responsible for a very big chunk of our market cap. So, in terms of global wealth.
But the initial wealth, though, to even have the opportunity to have a Zuckerberg appear, are we going to pretend like we didn't go all over Africa and pillage their gold and their oil? We just literally assassinated. We set up the assassination of Gaddafi because of he was going to put together the gold dinar and their oil because they were dominating both of those industries. And he was can you imagine assassinating the leader of the European Union? Because that's what we did when we assassinated Gaddafi. He was the chairman of the African Union that most people don't even know exists because it's in Africa. Exactly. So all of these factors, why do we go and pillage other countries' oils? We export 93% of our own oil now because it isn't about being able to sell our own oil. It's about making sure you can't sell it as competition. That's what it's about. And so all of that money is the foundation is ill-gotten. Some people create wealth, the right way, but most of our general wealth as a population is ill-gotten.
Yeah, so another answer to your questions, you were talking about, are all cultures created equal? That's kind of hard to say. I don't think there's any objective measure of morality or anything like that. But I will say that I think America is incredible. And the engine that drives why we're so great is because we value things like freedom and liberty and democracy and making sure people have as many opportunities as they can to succeed, because guess what? If more people had opportunities, where are those opportunities going to benefit? They're going to benefit the United States. And so I don't think we're destroying the engine by addressing these systemic inequalities. I think we're tuning up the engine and making sure it's actually running the way we intended.
I just want to give Niko props for offering to let me answer the question first when you asked it. That's all. It's very chivalrous.
Appreciate that. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right. So I don't want to make the mistake of conflating class issues with race issues. I'm sure that's frustrating for you guys if you believe it's actually a race issue. But you brought up specifically the resume study, and that study is specifically about the first names. Are you aware of a study where they use traditionally black last names? In fact, the black last names are more traditionally black than the first names.
I'm actually really aware of that study, which is why I wanted to let you know about the resume study, to let you know that it was a thing that existed.
No,
and then say that there's a meta-analysis of 28 studies.
But
so there's that study, and there's 27 more that all found the same thing.
I'm aware of a meta-analysis, but is it a meta-analysis of first names?
Actually, so I looked into the research methodology of the specific, I think, I always forget the names, the one you're talking about, and the reason they picked the first names as opposed to the last names, because the last names that they picked in the study you're referring to are things like Washington. And the reason they picked first names specifically over last names is because they were more recognizable as black. Have a resume in front of you that says Jeff Washington. I don't know if that's black or white, but in Jamal, you're more likely to say it's black. So the first name study, was actually better at measuring what it was able to measure. It was a more valid study than the last name study. And that's just in addition to the 27 other studies in the meta-analysis that I brought up.
I would completely disagree with that, because Washington and Jefferson, the last names that they use, over 90% of the people with those last names are black, as opposed to about 70-30 for a Jamal or another name.
No, but it doesn't matter what these actual people think. What they specifically tested these names for this reason. Which of these names brings up a black or white person the most consistently?
I'll agree to disagree with you on that. You also brought up the education funding. Are you aware that in the state of New Jersey, there's a series of Supreme Court decisions that are called Abbott decisions, where they normalize funding for specifically underfunded schools to counteract the property tax thing that you were talking about. And the schools that are called Abbott districts actually did not improve, despite the fact that they were funneling in something like $3 billion a year. But at the same time, they also allowed charter schools to develop in these areas, specifically charter schools in Newark. And some charter schools are bad, some are good, but they're spending less money per pupil, like $7,000 per pupil. and they're getting significantly better results. Like the black kids in the Newark charter schools are testing at about the same range
I'm worried
as
that
the
you think
rich
that there's
white
like,
kids.
yeah, I'm worried that you think that there's like a solution to help black people that I
Well, you were talking about a
won't like?
disparity in school funding, but I've
Yeah.
studied this education issue. I have an entire video series on education, and the funding isn't really the issue. It's if you funnel a ton of money into a corrupt institution like the public school system, you're not going to get good results. Are you in favor of letting these kids get out of their district schools and go to better schools?
I would be in favor of that if can everybody go? If this solution that you're proposing by necessity is leaving kids behind,
They
no,
have
I'm
to,
not in
they
favor
have to
of
go
it.
to a lottery because charter schools are restricted.
So what
by-
happens to the kids left behind
Well,
who don't win the lottery?
Well, that's why I would want to expand charter schools, so they don't have to get
But-
they don't have to line up for ping pong balls to determine whether or not.
And
their
at
kid
what
gets a
point
good
during that do we just
education.
end up with schools that everybody has to go to again?
Wait. Hang on. We're saying that we can't make improvements for some kids because other kids might not be able to take advantage of them by pure luck and chance of a lottery. I think if we can make
No, I'm
improvements,
saying that if
hang
that's
on,
the
hang
solution
on,
that you're
hang on,
offering.
Hang on, Justin. I'm saying that if we can make solutions right now that are going to help some kids and learn from those solutions and grow and iterate and expand, that's a good thing. That's still going to help those kids that win that lottery.
But-
It is going to help those kids with that lottery. Awesome. But then I really get the feeling that that's where we kind of want to stop it.
And,
But I just said we wouldn't.
basically what the argument is, oh, let's just hope that somebody ends up like Niko and gets lucky. And like that's not acceptable. Like I've spent my time making sure that you don't have to get that lucky and hope that you get a lottery in order to find success. But I would also say this, because there are, like I live in Miami, and actually there's a lot of good charter schools, which is, as a leftist, I know that's like an unpopular thing to say, but that's because these were like original charter schools before they were basically intended to overthrow the public school system. But what happens, you want more and more charter schools because we all know that it's true, the public school system is corrupt. So we're gonna pretend like private corporations aren't corrupt too?
Well,
We
I mean,
just gonna
listen,
pretend like that ain't?
hang on though. Like, I mean, this is something that we have to differentiate between the theoretical framework for something and the practical framework for something. And in a practical way, the best way to implement something is to do it with smaller sized groups, learn from how you're doing it, and continue to grow and expand. And so, like, just because you give it to a few kids now as part of like a charter program or a beta program or whatever, it doesn't mean that you can't later expand it. And in the meantime, hopefully it will still benefit some of those kids who are able to take advantage of it. And I don't know why we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater simply because we can't offer it to every single person right off the bat. In fact, it's not even ideal to offer it to every single person
you know what would
because
be
you want to grow and expand and make sure it's as good as it can
Maybe we
be.
should study these charter schools and find out what variables these charter schools have that are unique to public
I would
schools.
agree
and,
with that.
and then just start implementing it in the public
But-
schools. That way, so we
I
do the thing
would
you say.
actually not have an issue with
So,
that at all.
yeah, so
I
let's do
just
that.
I don't want to say like speaking of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like we all agree like once again the public school system is corrupt and the solution is let's switch to charter schools instead. Except for once again we just talked about the fact that in wealthy communities generally these schools that are funded really really well, and it's not like they just got started getting funding well like 5 years ago. This is like they've always been funded well. They do really well and they don't need a charter school in that community. So why are we gonna throw the baby out with the bathwater and pretend like it's always a bad outcome? And this, if we switch to charter schools, things will get better. No, we have to look at it. Clearly, funding has something to do with it, but there are a lot of reasons why education should be kind of like a mixed solution. That's what we need to do.
But we can't
But-
get to the point of applying the learnings from charter schools to public schools if we can't first try it and study it. And if we're having this argument about we have to do it for everyone or no one, then we can't get to that point.
I didn't ask. I didn't say we shouldn't, unless we can do it for everyone, we shouldn't do it for anyone. I'm just asking, like, what happened? I asked it a question. What happens to those kids who don't win the lottery?
Some
I mean, I
kids
just
do.
want to make sure they don't get left behind.
We've got
Let's say
one
no
more
child
time
left
to get
behind.
one last question in. Yeah.
So I go to art school here in Milwaukee.
Pull
and
it down a little bit so we can hear. Or
that height
pull the whole thing
discrimination.
towards you. Like, you know,
That height discrimination.
Pull it down. All right, so there you go.
Okay, thank you. So I go to art school here in Milwaukee, and because of everything that's going on, they have decided to get rid of like the European history class and the European art classes. And I know a lot of other schools are going to be doing like implementing white fragility for like kids to read, and they're also going to be doing like the 1619 project in schools too. And do Do you see them helping, harming, and like what do you think the consequences will be in the future?
White Fragility is an incredibly harmful racist book that is going to destroy the self-confidence of every single white person who reads it.
With no data whatsoever that was actually in the book itself, I had to find so much data and research outside of it. No, I think White Fragility is a pretty bad book because once again, it puts the problem of racism and the solutions that she offers are extremely individual. You know what? We can fix racism in this country if we just hire more HR managers. We can fix racism in this country if you just stop telling those dumb jokes about hair. No, these are really individual, paltry solutions to widespread systemic problems that we should all be in favor of. Like, what would be bad about having like the absolute, like the poorest, the most crime prone, and like the most disadvantaged people in our society? What would be the disadvantages to like bringing them back up? White Fragility is not going to tell you. It's going to tell you to, you know, when someone tells you you're racist, you should just nod and be accepting about it.
And by the way, too, I just want to add, I think that we've had a pretty robust conversation about systemic racism and by proxy kind of white privilege in this conversation. And I think you can have those conversations that are more nuanced while at the same time acknowledging that White Fragility is a horrible racist book written by a horrible racist author that no one should read ever.
Right. And Melissa,
It will be the one flag we fly together.
I will say, I don't really know if you call it, I would say it's very discriminatory. I don't know if you call it racist, but I would say it's very discriminatory. It's not productive. But I will say this also, and this is, and I feel like this is a good note to end on. At the end of the day, a lot of the benefits that you may have received for being white really wasn't your decision to make, right? It wasn't. The things that have happened to me or people who look like me because of my race, it wasn't my choice either. At the end of the day, there is an elite class basically modifying things that personally benefit them, and if you just happen to look like them or have similar experiences as them, you might be able to benefit from that too. But at the end of the day, we should be concerned about systemic racism for the reason I'm concerned if my sisters are experiencing discrimination based off of their gender or their sex, because eventually it trickles down. And as we're experiencing right now with COVID, it don't matter if you're black or white or whatever. When the government fails and when the elite fail us, we all fail.
It doesn't. So I just want like 20 seconds for Melissa real quick, because she did mention the 1619 project too.
No, I mean, and I think what you're seeing in like getting the European history out and European art, this is kind of the decolonized project, and it's kind of an attempt at epistemic subversion, because packed into all of these ideas and as you know people start talking about like white privilege, a lot of other ideas get packed into it, and the goal eventually is really to subvert a lot of the values, like Enlightenment values, that have brought a lot of progress to, you know, it's liberalized the world in ways that no other ideas ever have. And so that's my worry about eventually changing the curriculum. It's undoing a lot of progress.
All right, thanks. Go ahead. Thanks so much. I appreciate everybody on this panel. I know we went a little bit over time, but I agree with Karlyn. This was robust. It was fun.